EU leaders are hailing their draft deal with Turkey on the refugee crisis, which will see thousands deported from Greece and more perks for Turkey. The UN and rights organizations are not so optimistic, though, claiming the deal is a violation of humanitarian law. Questions are also being asked whether this deal is a quick fix for Europe's refugee crisis instead of actually tackling the root causes. In this edition of The Debate, we take a closer look at this draft deal and what it means for those who it will actually affect, the refugees.
At this EU-Turkey summit in Brussels, political leaders were discussing some highly controversial proposals with respect to the refugee crisis. They have agreed on a plan to return all refugees arriving into Greece from Turkey back to Turkey. An equal number would then be taken out of camps in Turkey and given homes in European Union countries.
By doing what we are intending to do, we'll break the business model of smugglers, exploiting human misery, and make clear that the only viable way to come to Europe is through legal channels.
Human rights groups are questioning the legality of the proposal.
By no stretch of the imagination can Turkey be considered a safe country to return people to. What the European Union and its leaders seriously need to do is look at how are we going to take control of this situation by offering safe legal routes to refugees through resettlement, by flying them in safely.
In return for its cooperation, Turkey wants €6 billion in financial assistance from the EU. Ankara is also demanding that Turkish citizens be given passport-free travel to EU countries in the Schengen area. Another condition includes the speeding up of EU membership talks. Negotiations at the Brussels summit were complicated by the fact that the Turkish government has just seized control of the country's biggest daily newspaper, which had been critical of President Erdogan. The matter was raised at the summit's closing press conference.
Freedom of speech is our common value, and there is no doubt that this value has been protected in Turkey and will be protected in Turkey.
Many experts believe that the refugee crisis has revealed cracks in the European Union's foundations that can never be repaired.
It is a widely held view that this crisis will see far-left and far-right political parties in the EU make huge gains over the next 2 years. Many commentators say the resulting unprecedented levels of Euroscepticism might well rip the 28-member bloc apart. Jerome Hughes, Press TV at the European Council, Brussels.
Well, let me start off by introducing our guest. Joining us from Bristol is investigative journalist Tony Gosling, and joining us from Brussels is the advisor to the European Parliament, Gary Cartwright. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here in this edition of The Debate. Now, Mr. Gosling, I'll start off with you, if I may. Now, what do you make of this deal? A historic agreement, as European leaders are hailing it, or is it just sweeping the actual problem under the rug?
Well, I think I always believe in talking rather than stalling. But I think after the act of President Erdogan in Turkey of storming the main newspaper in the country and beginning to take all of their archives offline over the weekend, shows that he's not serious. And in a way, we've got an ironic situation, haven't we, where people have been saying that he's actually suspended the constitution of Turkey by doing this. There are articles, many of the journalists at today's Zaman newspaper pointed this out in their columns published on the internet, because that's the only place they could get their columns published. That effectively what Erdogan's done is suspended the Turkish constitution. On Friday, he's set Turkey back on the bad old Midnight Express. Anyone that's seen that film from 1978, the horrific human rights abuses that there were in Turkey back in the 60s and 70s, and you know all of the progress that's been made with Turkey over the years went out of the window on Friday. I mean, I've been actually communicating with several of the journalists, and they are absolutely dismayed that the main newspaper in the country, which just happens to have fantastic amount of dirt on the current leadership, is taken out. Effectively, on Friday, Erdogan turned Turkey into a dictatorship, and yet on Monday Angela Merkel is quite happy to come to see him with initially 3 billion euros on the table for him. And now it seems from your report I've just heard there, now 6 billion euros are being talked about going to Turkey. I think it would the best act for any kind of honourable European Union this morning would be to have cancelled those talks and demanded that Turkey and Erdogan take seriously the idea of having a free press. Otherwise, there was going to be no deal. And extremely cheeky, really, for them to then say, oh, we want to speed up EU membership in EU accession. Very ironic, too, that we hear that they want to be part of the Schengen Agreement, just as the Schengen Agreement is falling to pieces.
Well,
so
let me just bring in Mr. Cartwright here. Mr. Cartwright, there are those who do believe that Turkey is basically blackmailing the EU. How would you respond to that?
That's actually a very good question, very good point, and I can understand why people would be saying that. I think that, however, we need to look at the current situation regarding the migration crisis, regarding the refugee situation, and regarding the offer that's been made or agreed over the last day or two. We need to look at that in the context of the narrative of Turkey's relationship with the European Union. It's often forgotten that Turkey became a member of the Council of Europe in 1949, an associate member of the European Economic Community in 1963, and has been a candidate country for accession since the latter part of 1999. And Turkey's moves towards Europe have constantly been rebuffed. Turkey, however, has been always not just a stable trading partner, but as a part of NATO, been an absolutely vital part of our common defence. And I've seen in the European Parliament many debates on Turkish membership, and I have to say that a lot of the arguments I'm hearing against are based on the fact that Turkey is an Islamic country, which it is not, it's a secular country, that Turkey is a very large and very diverse country, which it is. That's the world in which we live. And if Turkey may be perceived to be blackmailing the European Union, perhaps that's because Turkey has realised it has to demand, because it's not going to be given anything by Brussels unless it puts its foot in.
Right, let me just jump in there very quickly, if I may. One of the main objections to Turkey's accession to the EU is not because it may be perceived as an Islamic country, it's because of its recent human rights violations.
That's very true, and nobody can deny that in that particular area Turkey certainly has a lot to answer for, but we could probably say the same about a lot of our trading partners. We could say about China, we could say about Japan, we could talk about Russia and Ukraine. But Mr. Cartwright,
those trading partners
Moldova.
Are not being brought into the fold of the EU, or the fact that their accession requests are being speeded up, for example.
Well, that is actually the case with Moldova, which I think we can expect Moldova to come into the European Union fairly quickly. And when we look at some of the other post-Soviet countries, Bulgaria and Romania come to mind, their accession was speeded up because it was politically beneficial to the EU to have them within the Union. But as I say, Turkey, which has been playing ball with Europe since 1949, is still being rebuffed at every twist and turn.
Well, Mr. Gosling, what's your response to that? Is Mr. Cartwright's explanation here basically summing up this entire policy and process, which brought us to this deal where political interests take precedent over things like human rights?
Well, human rights is the number one issue, really, around the world. If you're going to get on with a regime, if you're going to trade, shake hands, give money to regimes, you need to have a good look at their human rights. And I noticed, Gary, you wrote actually an excellent book called Putin's Legacy, didn't you? Pointing the finger at Russia as human rights abusing. Well, in Russia, I'm afraid you don't see the government storming newspapers, blockading offices.
No, they just close them down.
Where officers will. I mean, we are actually having but sending the police in to close down newsrooms is not something that happens in Russia. And also, we've also had journalists arrested simply for doing their job. I don't know if you've noticed, but Can Dündar and Erdem Gül, in November the 26th, were arrested, 2 journalists, for treason, apparently. Actually, what they were doing was reporting, just doing their job. They were, just doing journalism. And this was all over an incident where they were reporting on the smuggling of weapons through south through the Turkish border into Syria for ISIS. There were also police arrested as well for stopping that shipment. This is extremely embarrassing for the Erdogan government to see that there are people within the country, including, it seems, the possibly Bilal Erdogan, the president's son too, who are profiting from the war that's going on over in Syria. So this is extremely embarrassing, and of course that's there in English on the Today's Zaman website for anyone to see. At least it was until the weekend when it was removed. But that isn't the only problem that there's been over there. So, what you're seeing effectively is arbitrary rule where the president doesn't want to be embarrassed, so he just sends the boys round to take out the newspaper that he doesn't like. Let me tell you, it's not the only example of the EU cooperating with countries where there are fascists operating. We're also talking about Greece. If you look at the Greek party, there's a Greek fascist party. There's also a fascist, quite a lot of them in Ukraine. But fascism is like a cancer, whether it's in Turkey, Ukraine or Greece. If you don't acknowledge it and you don't destroy it, it will destroy you. And I think Merkel has got to take a tough line, all of the EU leaders have, over any kind of cooperation with powers that are dictatorial and take these kinds of human rights abuses. And someone has written
let me get a response from Mr. Cartwright, and then we can move on. Mr. Cartwright, go ahead.
As someone that's written a book about human rights in Russia, I would have thought you would have go along with that, Gary.
Well, Tony, I have to say, regarding Russia's record with the media, we'll remember the murder of Anna Politkovskaya, and it was no surprise. She was a major critic of Vladimir Putin, and it was no coincidence that she was murdered on Putin's birthday. That sent out a very strong message. Foreign media is being shut down. In fact, foreign interests are being squeezed out of the Russian media. The internet is now being isolated to the point where Russia can actually shut out all foreign... I'm sorry, could you say again, Tony?
Are you saying that murder was done on the orders of the government in Russia? I mean, this close down of this newspaper was quite clearly done. I can tell you precisely,
Tony, I can tell you precisely the legal instrument that was used in order to justify that killing and also other killings, including that of Alexander Litvinenko.
All right, Mr. Cartwright,
this was an instrument
stick to the
passed in
topic here. We're talking about
2006,
Turkey's
which
human
gave
rights
Putin
role.
That's correct, but the debate there was extended slightly to Russia, and I wanted to answer Tony's questions. That which he said about Turkey and Turkey's human rights record, I agree with him absolutely. There's a great deal to be done, but are we really serving the best interests of the human rights campaigners by isolating Turkey? Would it not be best to embrace Turkey? I don't mean literally, but to give Turkey a bit more slack, because I feel in all the years I've been involved with European institutions, Turkey has been treated as a special case. There's nothing on the table for Turkey.
Right, but Mr. Cartwright, looking at the current human rights situation within Turkey, aren't you at all concerned that when these refugees are shipped back to Turkey, they might face some of these violations as well? Then that makes it basically against the EU's own laws as far as sending these refugees back to Turkey goes, and Turkey is not safe for these refugees.
Of course there are concerns, but refugees are being treated badly, not just in Turkey, but in other countries. I mean, we have, I think at the present time, I might be correct, 100 a day being turned away from the Austrian border, 200 a day being turned away from the German border. Bonheim in Germany recently, a small town, issued a law banning male asylum seekers and refugees from public swimming pools. Refugees are having their personal property confiscated in Germany. Their goods are being taken away from them to pay for their upkeep. I'm sorry, but refugees are not being treated very well within the European Union.
Mr. Gosling?
Well, look, it's a zero-sum game here. If I'm right in understanding what's been agreed today, I did have a brief look at it. There is going to be a whole load of migrants and refugees shipped back from Greece to Turkey, and an equal number shipped back in the other direction. That sounds to me like a zero-sum game. So why on earth is there €6 billion on the table for Turkey? Sounds absolutely bonkers, if you ask me. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense to be rewarding Turkey for what's happened. What this does prove is that the EU has completely failed. I'd be really interested to see what Gary asked, to see why you think this is. Completely failed to deal with. This is the second major international crisis the EU has failed to deal with. The first one was the financial crisis in 2008, where they put in charge a whole bunch of people from Goldman Sachs, etc., to have a look at the crimes of Goldman Sachs. Of course, that's the way the EU does things. And of course, we're now in the situation where Mervyn King, the former governor of the Bank of England, has said that there's going to be a serious crash this time. No bailout, a crash in the future. And that's the first crisis they failed to sort out. The second one is the migrant crisis, a complete failure of the EU. So it wouldn't be surprising if there's a lot of other people thinking like Britain is thinking, and maybe it's time to get out of this club.
Mr. Cartwright, I'd like to get your opinion on Mr. Gosling's statement there, but also, if there were so many question marks when it comes to Turkey, why then, instead of shipping these migrants back to Turkey, put more efforts in resolving the crisis in Syria, which is causing this refugee crisis to begin with?
First of all, I'd say that I do agree with Tony there. The European Union has completely failed in this current crisis. We have 28 member states all pulling in different directions. What this has done is it's exposed the fractures within the European Union. I think that what we're seeing now is effectively the end of Schengen as it was originally conceived. I think that there are now 6 countries, including Germany, that have basically pulled out of Schengen de facto by reintroducing internal controls. And I think that the Eurosceptics in Britain will now be saying that certainly the UK did the right thing in staying out. It has been a colossal failure. There's no question about this, no question whatsoever.
Right, Mr. Cartwright, you're not answering my question as far as wouldn't it be more prudent to put more resources in ending the conflict in Syria rather than talking about where to ship the refugees and where not to?
You're absolutely correct again, but resolving the conflict in Syria is very difficult. This is the first time, I think, in my life that I can recall seeing so many different powers all having their own private wars in Syrian space against different enemies. We've got Russians bombing the opposition, we've got NATO bombing Islamic State, we've got Turkey involved, we've got Jordan involved. I've never seen a mess quite like this. But I do feel that this refugee crisis from Syria is deliberate. I think that this may be a deliberate attempt to undermine the European Union by exposing the weaknesses of the external borders, by exposing and exploiting the differences between the member states. And I think that this particular crisis, we talk about the economic crisis there, I think we may be over the worst of that. But this migrant crisis, I think, could well be a catalytic moment for the European Union.
Well, before I get to Mr. Gosling for a response there, Mr. Cartwright, you just said that this might be a deliberate or a manufactured crisis. Who is behind it?
Well, again, I have to say that events in Syria since around about 2004, 2005, have been choreographed by the Kremlin. This began with or we became aware of it when they started to open up naval bases at Tartus and Latrika to make them accessible to large Russian warships. And then there were Russian surface-to-air missiles put in there to protect the area around Assad's homeland, manned by Russian soldiers, by the way, not by Syrians. And we now see Russian aircraft. We're talking about another Russian airbase opening up there. And I thought, particularly the recent bombing of 2 hospitals very close to the Turkish border by Russian aircraft sent out a very strong message saying, get out or we'll kill you. And that is, you will notice if you look, that created another blip in the refugees, the number of refugees fleeing the country.
Mr. Gosling, how would you respond to that?
I think that this is actually part of a hybrid attack on the European Union.
Well, I mean, it's just laughable to suggest that the Kremlin is behind the whole debacle in Syria. It's actually the West, the EU and the United States, mainly Britain and the United States, actually, that's been supporting the so-called opposition, armed opposition, the so-called friendly, nice rebels in Syria for the last 4 or 5 years. And also, it's worth pointing out that Roland Tue Mar, the former French foreign minister, pointed out on French television 2 or 3 years ago that actually British diplomats, we're assuming MI6, approached him when he was French foreign minister and said, we want to start an uprising in Syria, do you want to join us? So to lay that blame at the Kremlin's door, I'm afraid, is just simply not true. The other aspect to all of this, of course, is, yes, in a way, this has been, there's been a certain amount of orchestration of this, but let's take a look for a moment at Yemen. Are we going to have another wave of refugees from Yemen? What we could do immediately is to stop selling British arms and Western arms to the Saudi Arabian government and stop them killing. Now I think we're at about 8,500 civilians dead, killed by the Saudis. So we're going to have another wave of migrants coming across from there. The main problem as regards the crisis has been the failure to deal with the mafia who is smuggling people across the Mediterranean, making a tremendous amount of money at it, and the complete ineptitude of the EU and Frontex to actually deal with this in any kind of serious way. One wonders whether maybe they're taking a cut of the amount of money that the mafia are making. And the mafia are also making a lot of money in Italy from actually running refugee camps. So there's money being made, and while there's money being made, it's going to be very difficult to stop it unless the authorities and I suppose the media too acknowledge that this is a big mafia operation. So I think also well worth having a look at the documentary The Brussels Business, which was made in 2012 about the European Union, to see how it really operates, because it's simply not a democratic organisation, I'm afraid, Gary, and until it is, I'm afraid that it's going to look like the EU. This actually could be the beginning of the end of the EU, because if it was democratic...
On that note, let me just ask Mr. Cartwright to give his closing remarks. Could this be the end of the EU? Because both of you gentlemen agree that this is not a final solution or a lasting solution to the problem that Europe is facing.
This could indeed be the end of the European Union as we know it. There's no question about that. This is really the biggest crisis the EU's faced, and I don't think that the EU sees a way out. I would just like to say one thing, though, very finally, which is very, very important. I feel very strongly about this. We're talking about some very important and very difficult dynamics here, but what we're doing is we're dehumanising this. We're talking about human beings here, and I think that we're losing sight of that fact. These are men, women and children we're talking about, and if we dehumanise this issue, actually we do dehumanise ourselves, and I don't think we should lose sight of that fact.
Indeed. Let's leave it there for now. Unfortunately, time's gotten the better of us. That was the advisor to the European Parliament, Gary Cartwright, joining us from Brussels, and joining us from Bristol was investigative journalist Tony Gosling. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for participating in this edition of the debate. From me and the entire team here in Tehran, it's goodbye.